The air hung heavy and perpetually damp in the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, a verdant cathedral of towering Douglas firs and silent hemlocks. Mist, a constant companion, wreathed the colossal trunks, blurring the line between earth and sky, between reality and myth. Deep within this emerald labyrinth, where the sun seldom pierced the dense canopy, stood a small, unassuming cabin. Its weathered logs told tales of forgotten winters, its stone chimney a stoic sentinel against the relentless chill. Yet, it wasn't the silence that was most profound here. It was the sounds, or rather, the lack of them, punctuated by things that simply shouldn't be, especially at night. As dusk bled into a moonless velvet, the wilderness would awaken not with the familiar symphony of owls and coyotes, but with a primal hush. Then an occasional, unsettling snap of a distant twig, too heavy for a deer. A rustle in the undergrowth that wasn't the wind. Sometimes a low, resonant groan that seemed to thrum through the very bedrock. A sound unlike any known animal in these parts. It was these phantom auditions that clung to the cabin, wrapping it in an eerie, inexplicable tapestry of dread and wonder. This secluded dwelling was home to Elias Thorne, a man whose life had been irrevocably cleaved by tragedy. A former park ranger, his years had been spent dedicated to the preservation of these very forests, his heart attuned to their rhythms. But a devastating loss, a silence more profound than any the wilderness could conjure, had driven him deeper into its embrace. He sought not connection, but oblivion. A quiet solitude where the clamor of human grief could be muffled by the infinite whisper of the trees. He was a man carved from the rugged landscape he inhabited, his face etched with lines of worry, his eyes, once alight with bureaucratic passion, now holding the distant gaze of a prophet, haunted by visions unseen. He moved through the woods with the silent grace of a hunter, his knowledge of plants, animals, and terrain almost instinctive. Yet, despite his mastery of the wild, he found himself increasingly a stranger in his own home. Initially, Elias dismissed the small irregularities. A sack of dried apples, left cooling on the porch, would vanish overnight, leaving no trace of an animal's hurried feast. Later, a small, meticulously arranged pile of wild blackberries, far sweeter than any he'd gathered himself, would appear precisely where the apples had been. Then, a sprig of rare, luminous wildflowers, their petals still dewy, placed delicately on his chopping block. Bear, perhaps? He'd seen them lumbering through his property before, curious and opportunistic. But bears were rarely so tidy, so precise, so discerning. And they certainly didn't leave gifts. The feeling of being watched, however, was harder to dismiss. It was a subtle prickling at the back of his neck, a fleeting shadow at the edge of his peripheral vision, a sense of immense, unblinking presence just beyond the reach of his perception. He'd stand on his porch, rifle in hand, scanning the dense tree line, but found nothing. Only the impenetrable green, the whispering leaves, and the oppressive, watchful silence. He rationalized it as the isolation playing tricks on his mind, a natural byproduct of too much time spent alone with his thoughts, his grief. Yet the occurrences persisted, growing in frequency, escalating in their strangeness. The berries became regular offerings, sometimes even a perfectly gutted fish, laid out with an unsettling care. It was beyond any known animal behavior, defying every logical explanation his trained ranger's mind could conceive. The wilderness, he was discovering, held secrets far older and more profound than any he had encountered in his long career. Secrets that were slowly, deliberately, revealing themselves to him. The strange occurrences, the feeling of being observed, the inexplicable gifts. It was all coalescing into something far grander, far more mysterious than a mere hungry bear or a misplaced batch of berries. It was, he slowly began to realize, an invitation. An invitation from the wild itself. If you're captivated by stories that push the boundaries of what we know, tales of the unexplained, and deep dives into the mysteries that lurk just beyond our understanding, then you found your home. Don't let these incredible narratives disappear into the digital ether. Hit that subscribe button right now to join our community of truth seekers, and stay tuned for more compelling Sasquatch stories, cryptid encounters, and unsolved mysteries that will challenge everything you think you know about the world. You won't want to miss what Elias Thorne discovers next. The quiet nightly disappearances of food from Elias's porch soon escalated from an oddity to a pervasive mystery that gnawed at his solitary existence. What began as a subtle inconvenience, easily dismissed as opportunistic wildlife, slowly transformed into something more direct, more deliberate. The early morning light often revealed not just an empty bowl where stew had been left, but also a distinct impression in the soft earth at the edge of his porch, too large for a deer, too defined for a bear. His initial attempts to identify the culprit were rudimentary, driven more by curiosity than genuine concern. He rigged simple tripwires using fishing line, hoping to startle whatever creature was visiting, perhaps catch a glimpse. Yet, each morning, the lines lay undisturbed, often draped over the exact spot where he'd found the footprints, as if deliberately circumvented. Next, he deployed a small, motion-activated trail camera he'd used for observing elk in his ranger days. He positioned it strategically, aiming it squarely at the porch, convinced this would finally provide the irrefutable evidence he needed. For weeks, the camera captured only squirrels, raccoons, and the occasional curious fox. Then, one dew-laden morning, the camera's memory card held something different. A blurry, indistinct shape, massive and dark, moved with surprising speed across the frame. It was a fleeting image, poorly lit but undeniably large, humanoid in its general outline, yet covered in what appeared to be thick, shaggy fur. The image was grainy, distorted by the low light and the creature's quick movement, failing to offer any definitive features, yet it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. The accompanying sound recording, captured by a separate device he'd set up, contained a series of low, resonant thumps that dissolved into a rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs far too heavy for any local animal he knew. A strange, primal curiosity began to replace his initial fear. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't aggressive. It simply took what was offered, or perhaps what it found one evening. After a particularly bountiful harvest of wild berries, Elias felt an inexplicable urge to share. He left a generous portion of huckleberries and a half-eaten loaf of his homemade sourdough on a sturdy wooden stump near his cabin, a few yards from the porch where the previous incidents had occurred. By dawn, the stump was bare. The soft moss around it bore prints that echoed the blurry image from his camera, large, wide, and oddly human-like. This wasn't merely coincidence. It was communication. He started leaving food out intentionally, not as bait, but as an offering. A bowl of venison stew, left simmering on the porch railing, a cluster of freshly picked mushrooms, a chunk of wild salmon he'd caught himself. Each item disappeared by morning. An odd ritual began to form, a silent communion with an unseen entity. He found himself anticipating the morning reveal, a strange sense of companionship blossoming within his solitude. This wasn't just an animal seeking sustenance. There was a pattern, a carefulness in its movements, a consistent approach that hinted at something more. It never left a mess, never disturbed anything beyond the immediate vicinity of the food. It was almost respectful. Elias, a man of logic and scientific observation, felt his understanding of the natural world slowly unraveling. He retreated into his cabin, spending hours poring over old books, dusty tomes on local natural history, and archived ranger reports. He sought any mention of unexplained phenomena, unusual wildlife, or local legends. Most proved fruitless, filled with predictable accounts of bears, cougars, and the occasional wolf. But then, he stumbled upon scattered, dismissed accounts, old newspaper clippings from the late 1800s detailing wild men in the woods, a forgotten Park Service memo from the 1950s reporting inexplicable damage to a remote research camp attributed to large unknown primates before being officially retracted as bear activity, and even a series of cryptic native tribal legends speaking of Sasquatch, the hairy giants of the forest, protectors of nature. His scientific mind, trained to categorize and explain, wrestled with this new reality. Could these discarded tales, these blurred photographs and impossible footprints, truly point to something non-human, something thought to exist only in myth? The notion was absurd, yet the evidence accumulating around his cabin was becoming undeniable. He wasn't just observing a creature, he was interacting with it. He began to feel a peculiar loneliness intertwined with the mystery. His isolation, once a heavy cloak, was now both intensified by the inexplicable presence and, strangely, comforted by it. He was no longer truly alone in the vast wilderness. There was another, an unseen companion, observing him as he observed it. This connection, however tenuous, however silent, began to fill a void he hadn't realized was so deep. He started to suspect something profound and entirely untamed inhabited his woods, something that understood the silent language of shared sustenance. He was on the precipice of a discovery that would shatter his world, and possibly the world beyond his secluded cabin. Elias, still slightly unnerved by the blurry images his cameras provided and the indecipherable audio he'd recorded, began a new phase in his peculiar investigation. He started a formal routine of leaving food out on his porch every night, meticulously documenting what he offered and what was subsequently taken. This wasn't just a simple offering. It was an experiment, a desperate attempt to understand the enigmatic presence that shared his secluded world. He varied the menu. A bowl of hearty stew one night, a pile of fresh berries foraged from his property the next, then perhaps a piece of cooked fish, even a few slices of cured meat from his own stores. He soon noticed definite patterns, subtle preferences that began to paint a rudimentary psychological portrait of his unseen guest. The berries, especially the ripe sweet ones, were always gone without a trace, sometimes within an hour of being placed. Cooked vegetables, like potatoes and carrots from the stew, were consistently consumed, while tougher greens occasionally remained. Interestingly, the fish was taken eagerly, but the cured meat, while sometimes gone, often lingered longer or was only partially eaten. It suggested a certain discernment, a palate that preferred fresh, natural provisions over processed, preserved fare. Elias found himself spending his days not just foraging for himself, but for his nocturnal visitor, instinctively seeking out the ripest berries, the tenderest shoots, driven by a burgeoning, inexplicable sense of responsibility. This delicate dance continued for several weeks, each morning bringing a new riddle to solve, a new data point for his growing, unconventional research. The fear that had initially prickled his skin gradually receded. replaced by a consuming curiosity and something akin to a quiet companionship. He was no longer alone in the vast, silent woods, and the thought, though bizarre, was oddly comforting. Then came the night when the boundary between known and unknown blurred more dramatically than ever before. Elias had fallen asleep in his armchair, a book about regional flora resting open on his chest. He was jolted awake by a sound that tore through the stillness of the night, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of his cabin. It wasn't the howl of a wolf, nor the roar of a bear. It was something far more ancient, more primal, a sound that resonated with an animalistic intensity he'd never encountered. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, oppressive silence that followed. Instinct, sharpened by years in the wilderness, seized him. He didn't reach for a weapon, but for the edge of the thick curtain covering his living room window. Cautiously, with a trembling hand, he pulled it back just enough to create a narrow slit. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the dense shadows of the towering pines, was a massive, shadowed figure. It was impossibly huge, easily twice the height of any man he'd ever known, and its form was unmistakably bipedal. For a fleeting instant, he saw the outline of a broad shoulder, a powerful arm, before it melted back into the deeper darkness of the forest, moving with a silent, deliberate grace that belied its immense size. The raw, guttural sound he now understood had been the creature itself, an expression of something he couldn't yet fathom. Elias stumbled back from the window, his mind reeling. Was he going mad? Years of solitude in the wilderness could play tricks on a man, conjure phantoms from shadows and whispers from wind. But the sheer scale of what he'd glimpsed, the undeniable physicality of it, defied hallucination. His scientific mind, honed by years of observation and data collection, grappled desperately with the impossible reality confronting him. Every fiber of his being screamed that what he had seen simply could not exist. Yet his eyes, his ears, his very instincts told him otherwise. An untamed, intelligent creature, a legendary being, truly inhabited his woods. The knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. He spent the remainder of the night hunched by the window, the image seared into his mind, the memory of that primal sound echoing in his ears. Sleep was impossible. This was no longer just an animal, a large bear, or an elaborate prank. This was something entirely other. As the days turned into weeks, Elias's internal conflict raged. His rational brain fought against the undeniable evidence of his senses. He tried to explain it away. A trick of the light, an overactive imagination, a misinterpretation of a known animal. But the evidence continued to mount, not just in the absence of food, but in the peculiar gifts that began to appear on his porch, always after his offerings had been taken. He first noticed a small pile of perfectly arranged river stones, each one smooth and uniquely colored, laid out in a deliberate pattern. Another time, he found a cluster of rare, delicate fungi, the kind that only grew in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the forest, placed carefully beside his empty food bowl. Then, one morning, he discovered a small, intricately woven nest of twigs and moss, far too complex and delicate for any bird he knew, sitting precisely on the doormat. These weren't random occurrences. They were deliberate acts, responses, acknowledgments. They were gifts, offered in return for his own. His visitor, he realized, possessed not only intelligence, but also a capacity for reciprocity, for a form of communication beyond words. The woods around him, once a place of quiet refuge, now hummed with a profound and ancient mystery, a mystery that was slowly, silently, weaving itself into the very fabric of his solitary existence. The line between myth and reality had irrevocably blurred. The meticulously arranged stones, the rare fungi, the intricately woven twig nest, these offerings were more than just gestures. They were invitations, a silent dialogue. Elias, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a growing sense of responsibility towards this unknown entity, decided he could no longer remain a passive observer. The fleeting glimpse he'd caught had only intensified his need to understand, to witness firsthand the creature that walked his woods, ate his food, and left him cryptic tokens of appreciation. He knew it was a risk, a monumental step into the unknown, but the pull was too strong to resist. One night, as the moon climbed high and cast long, dancing shadows through the pines, Elias deliberately waited up. He chose a vantage point inside his cabin that offered a clear, unobstructed view of his porch, yet kept him hidden, a dark shape against the even darker interior. He moved a heavy armchair near the window, partially concealed by the worn curtains, and settled in, his rifle resting on his lap, more from habit than true intent. His heart pounded with a rhythm that vibrated through his entire body, a mixture of primal fear and exhilarating anticipation. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified in the profound silence of the wilderness. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. Just as Elias felt the tendrils of sleep begin to claim him, a subtle shift in the forest's atmosphere jolted him awake. The myriad tiny sounds of the night, the chirping crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed quiet, as if holding their breath. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom at the edge of the clearing, not just a patch of darkness, but a moving, living mass. It was impossibly tall, an immense hulking figure covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Elias held his breath, every nerve ending, screaming, "This was it! This was real!" The creature moved with an astonishing fluidity, its colossal frame navigating the uneven terrain with a ghost-like silence that defied its immense size. It was bipedal, walking upright with a slight, powerful sway, its long arms hanging low, almost to its knees. As it approached the porch, the sheer scale of it became staggering, dwarfing the cabin door, its head easily clearing the porch overhang. It paused at the edge of the porch, its massive head turning slowly, subtly, as if testing the air, assessing its surroundings. Elias couldn't make out specific features in the dim light, but he felt an undeniable sense of ancient intelligence radiating from it. The creature then cautiously stepped onto the porch, its footsteps barely audible on the wooden planks. It reached for the food bowl Elias had left, a hearty stew tonight, with a large, surprisingly delicate hand, its fingers thick and powerful, but moving with an almost graceful precision. It scooped a portion of the stew, not devouring it greedily, but rather taking it with a deliberate, almost respectful slowness. Then, as Elias watched in stunned silence, the creature lowered its hand to the porch floor and gently placed something beside the empty bowl. It was a small, intricately woven twig figure, a miniature effigy that resembled nothing he had ever seen, yet held an undeniable artistry. The creature turned its head once more, a quick, almost imperceptible glance towards the cabin, before melting back into the shadows of the forest with the same silent, ethereal grace it had arrived. Elias remained frozen, transfixed, long after the last trace of the magnificent creature had vanished. The rifle lay forgotten on his lap. He felt a kaleidoscope of emotions wash over him. Profound awe at the sheer majesty of the being, a lingering tremor of primal terror at its immense power, and an overwhelming, unexpected wave of connection. This wasn't some myth, some wild beast. This was an intelligent, sentient being, capable of thought, of communication, perhaps even of emotion. It had left him a gift, a tangible sign of its presence and its reciprocity. The realization was a seismic shift in his understanding of the world, of his place in it. From that night forward, a profound change occurred in Elias. His solitary existence, once punctuated by the quiet hum of the wilderness, was now defined by a new, silent partnership. He continued to feed the creature, methodically varying his offerings, eager to learn its preferences. He started leaving out different fruits, vegetables, and types of meat, observing what was taken and what was left. He began to call the creature Shadow in his mind, a fitting name for an entity that moved with such stealth and remained largely unseen, a sentinel of the deeper woods. Their nightly ritual became a strange, unspoken bond. Elias would prepare the food, place it on the porch, and then retire to watch from his window, sometimes catching another fleeting glimpse, sometimes only finding the empty bowl and a new, unique offering in the morning. Each gift, a perfectly shaped stone no larger than his thumb, a cluster of berries meticulously arranged, or another finely crafted twig figure, deepened his understanding, signaling not just intelligence but an almost artistic sensibility. He found himself looking forward to these nightly encounters, the anticipation becoming the highlight of his days. The gnawing loneliness that had plagued him since his retreat into the wild began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of companionship with this ancient, enigmatic being. He felt less alone than he had in years, connected to something profound and truly wild. However, as the months passed, a new layer of concern began to emerge. The subtle signs that had once been confined to his immediate vicinity were starting to spread. Whispers from the small, distant towns filtered through the infrequent trappers and hunters who ventured near his isolated cabin. There were increasing reports of unusually large tracks found closer to human settlements, strange, deep growls echoing through the valleys, and even more frequent disappearances of livestock from remote farms. The rumors spoke of an unprecedented bear activity, but Elias knew better. He knew it was Shadow, venturing further, perhaps out of growing hunger, or simply a broadening of its territory. This mounting external pressure, the increasing proximity of human fear and curiosity, began to cast a long, disquieting shadow over the fragile, secret bond he had forged with the forest's true guardian. Elias felt an ominous tightening in his chest, a premonition that their quiet peace was about to be shattered. The revelation that his silent companion, the creature he now instinctively called Shadow, possessed such a nuanced understanding of interaction, of offering something in return, deepened Elias's already profound sense of awe. The intricately woven twig figure he discovered on his porch, a masterpiece of natural craftsmanship, confirmed his deepest suspicions. This was no mere beast. It was a sentient being, capable of thought, intention, and perhaps even a form of gratitude. Their nightly ritual had solidified into a strange, almost sacred bond, one that transcended language. Elias felt less alone than he had in years. The vast, echoing silence of his cabin now filled with the unspoken presence of another. The woods, once a sanctuary for his grief, had become a shared space, rich with an unbelievable, unfolding narrative. He continued his routine, leaving out various offerings, observing Shadow's preferences, trying to understand the cryptic messages in the gifts left in return. There was a delicate dance of cautious trust unfolding between them. A silent conversation played out under the watchful eyes of the ancient trees. Elias found himself looking forward to the dusk, to the quiet moments when he would place the food, then retreat, listening for the subtle rustle, the barely perceptible shift in the air that signaled Shadow's arrival. He felt a deep, almost paternal protectiveness for this creature, a being so powerful, yet so vulnerable in its hidden existence. However, the peace of their unique understanding was not destined to last. Elias had been increasingly hearing distant echoes of human encroachment. Rumors from the nearest small towns, carried on the occasional supply run, spoke of increased bear activity and strange, unsettling growls emanating from deeper within the forest than usual. It was clear that Shadow, perhaps venturing further afield in its foraging, was drawing closer to the edges of civilization, making its presence felt by those less inclined to interpret such signs with wonder than with fear. A gnawing anxiety began to prick at Elias's newfound contentment. He knew the volatile mix of human curiosity and fear, especially when confronted with the unknown. Then came the afternoon that shattered their fragile tranquility. Elias was inside, cleaning his rifle, a habit from his ranger days, when he heard it. A cacophony of loud, boisterous laughter and excited shouts drawing closer. A group of hikers, clearly off the main trails and heading straight towards his property line. His heart immediately sank. He knew Shadow often lingered nearby in the late afternoon, awaiting the twilight offering. He peered out, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. As the hikers crested a small rise, their voices amplified by the clearing air, Elias saw it. Shadow had just emerged from the dense undergrowth, its massive silhouette momentarily framed against the fading afternoon light, moving silently toward the porch. But at the sudden, jarring outburst of human noise, the creature froze. It wasn't merely startled. Its entire posture conveyed an instantaneous, profound terror. Its immense head snapped towards the sound, and Elias saw an undeniable tremor run through its massive frame, a visible shiver of pure, unadulterated fear. The hikers, oblivious, continued their raucous banter, their high-pitched laughs echoing through the trees. Shadow let out a low, almost imperceptible whimper, a sound of such profound distress that it pierced Elias's very soul. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and bolted. It didn't merely retreat. It fled, crashing through the undergrowth with a desperate urgency, a panic-driven flight deep into the impenetrable forest, leaving behind only the fading echoes of human mirth and a gaping void in Elias's heart. Elias stood transfixed, the rifle forgotten in his hands. He had witnessed Shadow's immense power, its silent majesty, its surprising tenderness in leaving gifts, but he had never seen this pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't just avoidance. It was an innate, visceral dread. The human voice, so mundane to him, was a weapon, a source of unbearable fear for this magnificent wild being. It was a stark, brutal revelation. He spent the next few days in a state of quiet agitation. Shadow did not return. The food remained untouched. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, no longer comforting, but alarming. Driven by his observation and a growing sense of guilt, Elias began to test his theory. He knew it was a cruel experiment, but he needed to understand the extent of this vulnerability. The next evening, he placed the usual offering on the porch. He waited, hidden, observing the edges of the forest. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a shadow detach itself from the shadows, closer than before, but still hesitant. Shadow was back, but fear had clearly taken root. As the creature cautiously approached, its movements slower, more tentative, Elias, from behind his cabin door, spoke softly at first. "Hello, old friend." The effect was instantaneous and heartbreaking. Shadow flinched violently, its head jerking back as if struck. It took a rapid step backward, then another, its huge frame visibly recoiling. Even Elias's gentle, familiar voice was enough to evoke a deep-seated fear. He tried again, even softer. "It's just me, Elias." The creature emitted a low, guttural groan, a sound of deep anguish mixed with fright, and then, with another panicked bolt, vanished once more into the protective embrace of the wilderness. Elias sank to the floor, his stomach churning with despair. He understood now. Despite its immense size, its unparalleled strength, Shadow, the legendary Bigfoot, was incredibly vulnerable. Not to bullets, not to traps, but to the very essence of human presence, and specifically to the sound of human voices. It was a profound, almost tragic irony. This creature, a living embodiment of the wild, though being capable of moving mountains in its silence, was terrified by the very sound that defined humanity. Elias felt a surge of fierce, unwavering protectiveness. His role had shifted. He was no longer just a feeder, an observer. He was now a guardian, charged with protecting a secret and a life far more fragile than anyone could ever imagine. The woods were no longer just his refuge. They were Shadow's sanctuary, and he would defend it with every fiber of his being. Elias felt a profound shift within himself, a protective instinct blooming fiercely in his solitary heart. The revelation of Shadow's debilitating fear of human voices had not merely surprised him. It had ignited a purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. This majestic, powerful creature, capable of traversing the deepest wilderness with silent grace, was startlingly vulnerable to the casual cacophony of human presence. Elias saw it not as a weakness, but as a deep sensitivity, an ancient wisdom that understood the inherent danger of his own species. From that moment, his life's mission transformed. He would become Shadow's silent guardian, its unseen protector against the encroaching world. He began by subtly, but effectively, rerouting the scarce human traffic that ventured near his isolated cabin. Old, faded trail markers were accidentally knocked down or pointed in misleading directions, guiding hikers away from the more secluded routes that Shadow favored. He meticulously gathered fallen branches and leaves, creating convincing, though entirely false, animal tracks. Large, clumsy deer prints, or the telltale drag marks of a bear, leading off into dense, impassable thickets, painting a picture of mundane wildlife activity that discouraged further exploration. He even went so far as to leave out pungent, natural deterrents, like aged fish scraps, strategically placed along old logging trails, making those pathways less inviting for casual strollers seeking pristine wilderness. His cabin, once a haven of solitude, became a strategic outpost in an undeclared war for Shadow's safety. But the wilderness, vast and untamed as it was shrinking. Rumors, like whispers on the wind, began to circulate in the nearest towns. Tales of a wild man or a giant ape in the deep woods gained traction, fueled by exaggerated campfire stories and blurry photos taken by overzealous amateur cryptid hunters. The initial curiosity quickly morphed into something far more dangerous. The whispers turned to shouts, and the shouts attracted a new kind of visitor: hunters, not for deer or bear, but for legend. Equipped with high-powered rifles, night vision, and an insatiable hunger for the sensational, these thrill-seekers began venturing deeper and deeper into the forest, their presence a palpable threat that tightened Elias's chest with dread. They spoke of a trophy, a once-in-a-lifetime catch, their words echoing with a sinister intent that chilled him to the bone. The forest, once a sanctuary, now thrummed with a new, unsettling energy. Shadow, acutely sensitive to the shifting dynamics, began to retreat. The nightly visits, once a comforting ritual, ceased. Elias continued to leave out offerings of fruit, nuts, and tender berries, placing them carefully on the porch, just as he always had. But night after night, the food remained untouched, chilled by the morning dew, a stark testament to Shadow's absence. The silence that followed was deafening, a hollow ache in the space where a quiet communion once existed. Elias walked the familiar paths, searching for signs, for a broken twig, a large track, anything that would indicate Shadow's continued presence, but found nothing. The forest felt empty, the air heavy with a nameless sorrow. His heart heavy with anxiety, Elias realized his subtle diversions were no longer enough. The threat was intensifying, becoming too pervasive, too determined. He couldn't keep Shadow safe through passive means alone. He imagined the creature, so easily startled by human voice, now constantly on edge, hiding deeper in the impenetrable tangles of the forest, its ancient patterns of life disrupted, its sense of security shattered. The thought was unbearable. He had grown to care for Shadow, with an intensity he hadn't known himself capable of since losing his own family. This creature, this myth made flesh, had become his silent confidant, his connection to the primeval wild. A cold, hard resolve began to form within him. He understood that protecting Shadow might mean abandoning his cherished solitude, that it might force him into the very scrutiny he had sought to escape. But the alternative, the potential demise of this unique, intelligent being, was unfathomable. He had to act decisively, to create a plan that would ensure Shadow's continued survival, even if it meant exposing himself, even if it meant facing the disbelief, the ridicule, or even the outright hostility of a world unprepared for such a truth. The time for silent guardianship was over. He needed a more direct, more impactful intervention, a way to make this corner of the world truly safe for Shadow, whatever the cost. The old ranger in him, the one who once protected vast swathes of wilderness, was reawakening. But this time, his ward was not a species, but a singular, extraordinary being. The crisp dawn air, usually a herald of peace, shattered into a cacophony of fear and violence. A series of sharp, resounding cracks ripped through the serene forest, followed by a guttural roar of pain that was unmistakably Shadow's. Elias, jolted awake by the sudden eruption of sound, felt a cold dread seize his heart. Gunshots. They weren't random. They were deliberate, aimed. His mind raced, calculating the distance, identifying the direction. It was too close, dangerously close to his property line, precisely where he had last seen signs of Shadow's cautious return. A primal scream, raw and desperate, tore through the woods, echoing the very anguish deep within Elias's soul. He knew this sound. It was the cry of a creature cornered, fighting for its life against an overwhelming, incomprehensible threat. Without a second thought, driven by an instinct far older than his years as a ranger, Elias sprang from his bed. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, reaching for the worn leather strap of his old ranger rifle hanging above the fireplace. The familiar weight of the firearm in his grip provided a strange comfort amidst the rising panic. Ammunition was swiftly loaded into the chamber, the metallic click a stark percussion against the continued chaos outside. He bypassed his usual preparations, ignoring the cold morning air biting at his skin, and burst from the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he ran, scrambling over roots and ducking beneath low branches, the sounds grew clearer, more terrifying. He could hear the excited shouts of men, punctuated by more gunshots, and then another pained, desperate bellow from Shadow, closer still. A red haze of fury descended over Elias. These weren't hunters seeking food. They were thrill-seekers, trophy hunters, driven by a perverse desire to conquer the unknown. He emerged into a small clearing, his breath ragged, and there they were. 3 men, heavily armed, their faces grimly, exhilarated, had Shadow cornered against a sheer rock face. The magnificent creature, its usually proud stance now slumped, was bleeding from a wound on its massive shoulder, its eyes wide with terror and anguish, its chest heaving. It was a sight that tore at Elias's very core. "Stop! Everyone freeze!" Elias's voice, amplified by years of shouting commands across vast wilderness, boomed through the clearing, momentarily stunning the hunters into silence. His rifle was raised, pointed squarely at the lead hunter, its barrel steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This is restricted federal land. You are trespassing, discharging firearms illegally, and endangering protected wildlife." He knew it was a bluff. His ranger days were long over, his authority dissolved, but he banked on the shock, on the fear of federal prosecution. The men, momentarily disoriented by the sudden appearance of an armed, authoritative figure, exchanged confused glances. The lead hunter, a burly man with a scruffy beard, scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Who the hell are you? We're just hunting game, old man. And that ain't no protected animal." He gestured crudely towards the bleeding Shadow. "This entire area is under a new highly classified environmental protection order," Elias retorted, his voice unwavering, laced with the steel of command. He advanced slowly, deliberately, his rifle still trained on them. "Any unauthorized presence, let alone weapon discharge, carries severe federal penalties. You're looking at significant jail time and massive fines." He knew he was laying it on thick, but he needed to create enough doubt, enough fear, to buy Shadow some precious seconds. "Now, drop your weapons and get out, or I'll personally ensure you spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." His performance, fueled by pure adrenaline and fierce loyalty, had the desired effect. The hunters, clearly amateur and unprepared for confrontation, began to waver. One of them, younger and visibly nervous, fumbled with his rifle. In the sudden confusion, as they started to lower their weapons and murmur nervously, a shot inexplicably rang out. It wasn't aimed at Shadow, nor at Elias, but fired wildly, a consequence of panic. A searing pain blossomed in Elias's left arm as he instinctively recoiled, the bullet grazing his forearm. He gasped, but quickly regained his composure, using the distraction to his advantage. "That's it," he roared, clutching his arm, his voice now laced with genuine fury and pain. "You just assaulted a former federal officer. That escalates everything. Get out of here now, before I call in the full force of the law." The hunters, now utterly demoralized and terrified, needed no further encouragement. They scrambled, tripping over roots, their bravado completely evaporated. They disappeared into the dense undergrowth, their shouted apologies and frantic footsteps fading quickly into the distance. Elias watched them go, his rifle still up, until their sounds were completely gone, replaced by the heavy silence that followed chaos. He slumped against a tree, his left arm throbbing, the warmth of blood blooming on his sleeve. He turned his attention immediately to Shadow. The creature was gone. In the brief window of diversion, it had somehow managed to heave its massive form over the rock face, disappearing into the impenetrable, steeper terrain beyond. Elias pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp pain in his arm, and hobbled to the rock. He saw faint smears of blood, leading upwards, and a few dislodged stones. Shadow had escaped, but at what cost? Was it grievously wounded, or had it simply fled, terrified and in pain, seeking refuge where no human could follow? The forest, once again, offered no answers, only the unsettling quiet of an unfinished drama and the deepening anxiety in Elias's heart. He was alone, bleeding, and consumed by the agonizing uncertainty of Shadow's fate. Weeks melted into months, the crisp autumn air giving way to the biting chill of winter, and then the tentative promise of spring. Elias's arm, though healed, bore a faint scar, a physical reminder of that desperate, chaotic evening. The hunting frenzy, thankfully, had subsided. Whether it was the lack of a trophy, the difficulty of the terrain, or perhaps a lingering unease from his authoritative confrontation, the woods had gradually returned to their accustomed quiet. Elias, for his part, had also returned to his routine, a silent vigil maintained each night. He still placed the offerings on his porch, fresh berries in season, dried fruit and nuts when the forest was barren, and occasionally a small, carefully prepared portion of stew left to cool. Night after night they remained untouched. The silence, initially a torment, had softened into a quiet resignation, yet hope, a stubborn ember, never quite died. He continued to watch the tree line, scan the forest floor for any telltale sign, his senses heightened, perpetually alert. Then, one mild evening, as the first stars began to prick holes in the twilight sky, something was different. As he approached the porch, his gaze instinctively fell upon the familiar spot where he always left the food. There, beside a small, perfectly peeled apple that still bore the faint sheen of morning dew, lay a twig figure. It was meticulously crafted, its tiny branches woven with a nascent artistry, a miniature likeness of the larger one Shadow had left so long ago. And nestled within its delicate embrace, a rare, vibrant wild orchid, its purple petals unfurling in the fading light, a species Elias knew grew only in the deepest, most secluded parts of the forest, far from any human path. A tremor ran through Elias. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a sign. It was a reaffirmation, a renewal of a bond he had feared was irrevocably broken. Shadow had returned, or at least had made its presence known. The relief that washed over him was profound, a cathartic release of months of worry and a silent, gnawing grief. He knelt, gently picking up the orchid, its delicate beauty a stark contrast to the rough, powerful creature it represented. He understood then that their connection, though built on silence and distance, was enduring, a testament to an unspoken trust forged in the heart of the wild. He hadn't seen Shadow, and perhaps he never would again, not in the direct, undeniable way he once had. But he didn't need to. The twig figure, the orchid, they were enough. They were a whisper across the chasm of their different worlds, a promise of continued coexistence. Elias realized that his purpose had shifted. He was no longer just a recluse seeking solace, nor merely a former ranger living out his days. He had become a guardian, a silent sentinel for the unseen, the unheard, the untamed spirit of the forest. His solitude, once a burden, now carried a profound and sacred meaning. He dedicated himself to guarding this patch of wilderness, not just for its conventional beauty or its designated status, but for the elusive, intelligent life it harbored. He spent his days mending fences, clearing paths, and strategically placing subtle deterrents further afield, creating a buffer zone invisible to the casual observer, but understood by the creatures of the woods. He became even more attuned to the rhythms of the forest, learning to read the subtle shifts in wind, the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves, messages that often carried deeper meanings for those who knew how to listen. He ensured that the stream remained pristine, that the berries flourished, that the ancient cedars stood undisturbed. His role was not to find shadow, but to ensure that shadow could always be there, safe and free within its own domain. Elias understood now that some mysteries were not meant to be solved with human logic or scientific classification. Some were meant to be respected, to be simply known. In the deepest sense, understood not through dissection or capture, but through awe, acceptance, and a profound reverence for the unknown. Shadow was not a specimen, it was a being, a vital, powerful force of nature. Their tale was one of unexpected connection, of fear transmuted into fierce protection, and of a deep, abiding respect for a world beyond human comprehension. It was a story that whispered of the wild heart that still beat within the deepest forests, reminding humanity that there were wonders still hidden, still thriving, waiting for those humble enough to simply listen and protect. So, as the sun dipped below the distant peaks each evening, Elias would prepare his humble offering, placing it carefully on the porch. He would then sit by his window, watching the deepening shadows lengthen, feeling the pulse of the forest, and knowing that somewhere out there, in the impenetrable green twilight, a kindred spirit also watched, existed, and thrived because of a shared, silent understanding. His days of loneliness had been replaced by a quiet companionship, a purpose woven into the very fabric of the wild. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the heart of the unknown, where the boundaries between myth and reality blur. We hope Elias's story has stirred something within you, a sense of wonder, and perhaps a call to respect the mysteries that still linger in our world. If you've been captivated by this tale of an unexpected bond, please like this video, share it with fellow enthusiasts of the unexplained, and consider subscribing to our channel for more compelling stories of cryptids and the enduring enigmas that challenge our understanding. What are your thoughts on Elias and Shadow? Have you had your own experiences or beliefs about Sasquatch or other cryptids? Share your perspectives in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and your mind open to the impossible.